The wind howls through the ancient stone corridors of the Yedikule fortress in Istanbul at 0300 hours, carrying with it something that no modern soldier should ever hear, the deep rhythmic boom of 15th century siege cannons. Not a recording, not a drill. Real. You snap awake in your bunk, heart hammering, and for a split second the walls of your barracks aren't painted cinder block anymore. They're the Theodosian walls, 14 kilometers of triple-layered stone that once held back the Ottoman Empire. Then the vision fades, leaving only the smell of black powder and the distant screams of men dying in armor that hasn't been forged for 573 years. This is not a history lecture. This is a military paranormal incident report that has circulated in hushed voices through the Turkish land forces for more than a decade. The Yedikule Barracks, officially the 4th Infantry Training Battalion's secure annex inside the Seven Towers Fortress complex, sit directly atop the southern anchor of Constantinople's legendary land walls. Built by Mehmed II himself after the conquest, the fortress was later expanded into a modern training facility. What the engineers never accounted for was that the ground still remembers 1453. Between April 6th and May 29th of that year, Sultan Mehmed II, only 21 years old, brought an army estimated between 60 and 80,000 men against a Byzantine force of fewer than 8,000, led by Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos. The Ottomans dragged 70 ships overland to bypass the massive chain across the Golden Horn. Urban's Bombard, the largest cannon ever cast at the time, hurled 600-kilogram stone balls that cracked the impregnable walls. On the 53rd day, the city fell. Constantine died fighting incognito among his troops. The Middle Ages ended at sunrise on May 29th. Those facts are in every textbook. What the textbooks don't mention are the residual signatures that never dissipated. Multiple after-action reports, psych evaluations, and internal Turkish armed forces memoranda, some now declassified, describe the same phenomena. Cannon fire with no source, armoured figures marching through locked corridors, and a cold mist that smells of blood and incense. Tonight we present 7 first-person testimonies from soldiers who served at Yedikule Barracks between 2023 and 2025. These men are not conspiracy theorists. They are combat-trained professionals who swore an oath and still wake up reaching for rifles that aren't there. The Siege of Constantinople was never truly finished. It simply moved indoors. Chapter 1. The Midnight Bombardment. I'm Sergeant Mehmet Aksoy, 4th Infantry Training Battalion, Turkish Land Forces. I'd been assigned to Yedikule Barracks for 6 weeks when the first incident occurred. It was the night of March 12th, 2024. I drew the 0200 to 0400 watch on the perimeter wall overlooking the old Golden Gate section of the Theodosian walls. Standard duty. G3 rifle slung across my chest. PVS 14 night vision monocular flipped down over my right eye, and thermos of strong black tea clipped to my webbing. The lights of modern Istanbul glowed to the north and west, cars streaming along the coastal roads like distant fireflies. But inside the fortress compound, the darkness felt different, thicker, heavier, as if the stone itself was pressing in. Yedikule, the fortress of the Seven Towers, was constructed by Sultan Mehmed II shortly after the 1453 conquest. 3 new towers were added to the existing Byzantine fortifications, creating a self-contained strongpoint that later served as treasury, prison, and now a training annex for our battalion. The old walls beneath our modern barracks still bear the scars of that siege, pockmarks from cannon fire, repaired sections where stone met stone in desperate haste. During the day, it was just another historic site with tourists snapping photos. At night, especially after midnight, the place changed. At precisely 0317 hours, I felt the first vibration. It started low in the ground, travelling up through the soles of my combat boots like a distant earthquake. Then came the sound, a deep, rolling boom, not like any modern artillery I'd trained with. This was slower, more guttural, the kind of thunder that lingers in your chest. The stone parapet under my gloved hands trembled. I keyed my radio immediately. Tower 1 to command. Contact. Possible external explosion or construction activity to the south. Request verification. The duty officer's voice crackled back, half amused. Tower 1. Negative on all sensors. Construction crews aren't scheduled until 0800. Probably just the wind or a truck backfire on the highway. Stay frosty. I acknowledged, but something felt wrong. The air had grown colder, carrying a sharp, acrid scent I recognized from range days. Burnt black powder mixed with hot iron and something earthier, like freshly turned soil soaked in blood. My monocular suddenly flared white with bloom. I cursed and flipped it up, blinking against the after-image. When my vision cleared, the ridgeline to the south, empty scrub and modern fencing in daylight had transformed. There, silhouetted against a sky that somehow looked older, stood a monstrous cannon. It was enormous, easily 20 feet long, its bronze barrel gleaming with an unnatural greenish hue under starlight that didn't match the Istanbul night. Teams of men in white turbans, chainmail, and padded jackets scrambled around it like ants servicing a beast. Oxen lowed in the distance as handlers steadied the massive carriage. I recognized it instantly from every documentary I'd ever watched. Urban's Bombard, the supergun cast by the Hungarian engineer for Mehmed II, the one that shattered the impregnable Theodosian walls. My training took over. I dropped to a knee behind the parapet, brought my G3 up into a stable firing position, safety off, finger indexed along the trigger guard. "Identify yourselves," I shouted into the night, my voice echoing off the ancient stone. "Turkish land forces. You are in a restricted military zone." No response. One of the figures, a tall man with a bronze helmet obscuring his face, turned slowly toward my position. He raised a hand, not in threat, but in what looked like a weary salute, as if acknowledging another soldier on the line. Then the crew finished loading. A glowing stone ball, easily 600 kilograms, was rammed home. The master gunner stepped back, touching a slow match to the touch hole. The second boom was cataclysmic. The pressure wave slammed into my chest plate like a physical blow, forcing the air from my lungs. The cannonball streaked forward in a low arc, trailing faint fire and smoke. It passed directly through the space where my head had been moments earlier. Had I not ducked instinctively, it would have taken me clean off the wall. Instead, it slammed into the barracks building behind me with a sound like the end of the world. Stone cracked, dust billowed. But when I spun to check the damage, there was nothing. No crater, no debris, no shattered masonry. Only the echo of a breach that happened 571 years ago. My heart pounded against my ribs. Sweat stung my eyes, despite the freezing air. I scanned the ridgeline again through iron sights. The cannon and its crew were still there, reloading with mechanical precision. Shouts in archaic Ottoman Turkish drifted across the gap. Orders, prayers, curses. One voice rose above the rest, young but commanding. Mehmed II himself, urging his artillerymen onward. I stayed glued to that wall for the remainder of my shift, rifle trained on ghosts that refused to vanish. Every few minutes, another boom would roll out. Another phantom ball would streak toward the ancient line. I watched sections of the Theodosian walls flicker into existence, tall, proud, then crumbling under the barrage, only to snap back to the patched modern remnants. When Corporal Kaya finally arrived for relief at 0400, he found me still in firing position, knuckles white on the grip, breath coming in shallow bursts. "And Sergeant Aksoy? You look like death. Everything all right up here?" I lowered my weapon slowly, the metal warm in my hands despite the cold. I couldn't speak at first. How do you explain watching the fall of Constantinople unfold in real time from a watch post in 2024? How do you describe the weight of history pressing down so hard it feels like the walls are bleeding? "I think the siege just started again," I finally muttered. "And we're standing on the wrong side of the line this time." Kaya laughed nervously, but the laugh died when he caught the look in my eyes. He glanced out over the darkened grounds. For a moment, I thought he saw it too, the faint muzzle flashes on the phantom ridgeline. But he said nothing. We walked back to the barracks in silence, the scent of gunpowder clinging to my uniform like a promise. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the bombard roar and saw that helmeted gunner salute me across 5 centuries. The forgotten siege wasn't a history lesson anymore. It was live fire, and Yedikule barracks had become the front line once more. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Janissaries. I'm Corporal Hassan Kaya. Same battalion, same cursed posting at Yedikule barracks. After Sergeant Aksoy's night on the wall, the platoon started paying closer attention. We joked about it in the mess hall the next day. Old stones playing tricks, maybe bad tea or stress from training cycles. But the jokes felt forced. By the evening of March 13th, 2024, the laughter had died completely. I pulled interior security that night. Lights out at 2300 hours. My job was a final sweep of B Block. Out the long stone corridor on the ground floor of the old Ottoman-era barracks wing. The walls here are original, massive limestone blocks laid by Byzantine hands, later reinforced under Mehmed II. Steel bunk beds lined both sides in neat military rows, lockers at the foot of each. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, but the emergency reds kicked in automatically after midnight for energy conservation. The corridor always felt narrow at night, the ceiling low, the air thick with the smell of boot polish, gun oil, and something older I couldn't quite place. I moved quietly, maglite in my left hand, right resting near my sidearm. Standard procedure. Check doors, check shadows, listen for anything out of place. At approximately 23:45, I heard it. Marching. Not the rhythmic stomp of modern combat boots on tile. This was different. The soft shuffle of bare or sandaled feet mixed with the creak of leather soles. The faint clink of metal on metal, all in perfect, disciplined cadence. It came from the far end of the corridor, growing steadily louder, as if an entire company was approaching from the locked day room. I froze mid-step, thumbing the maglite to full beam. "Who's there? Identify." The sound didn't stop. Then they appeared. Janissaries, dozens of them, marching four abreast down the narrow hall, straight toward me. They wore the distinctive white felt Burke hats, cylindrical, folding slightly at the neck, with the small spoon-holder kashaklik at the front. Their kaftans were a deep green wool, trimmed in red and blue, layered over mail shirts, that glinted dully in my flashlight beam. Curved yataghan swords hung at their hips, each some carrying matchlock arquebuses or axes. Their faces were young, many no older than 18 or 19, yet hardened, eyes focused forward with a 1,000-yard stare of veterans who had trained since childhood in the Devshirme system. The temperature plummeted. My breath fogged visibly in the red emergency light. The air filled with the scent of wood smoke, sweat, incense, and oiled steel. One soldier near the front, a lean young man with a sparse beard and a small scar across his cheek, turned his head and locked eyes with me. His gaze was not empty. It was alive, tired, determined, and strangely respectful. He spoke in clear but archaic Ottoman Turkish, words I understood as if I had heard them all my life. "The city will fall tonight, brother. Stand with us or be crushed beneath the walls. The Sultan has promised paradise to those who breach the line." I raised the flashlight like a weapon, my other hand dropping to my holster. "This is a restricted area. Halt." The beam passed straight through his torso. He didn't flinch. Instead, he offered a small, sad smile, the smile of a man who had seen too many walls and too many refusals, then continued marching. The entire formation flowed around and through me as if I were mist. I felt the chill of their passage like icy fingers brushing my skin. I followed them, boots echoing loudly against their silent steps. They reached the heavy steel door at the end of B block, the one leading to the day room, always kept locked after hours. Without pausing, they passed straight through the metal as if it weren't there. I fumbled with my keys, heart slamming, and shoved the door open. On the other side, in the empty day room with its plastic chairs and faded motivational posters, the full company had formed ranks. They stood at perfect attention in tight formation, weapons grounded or shouldered. An invisible officer moved down the line, inspecting kit. I heard the soft clink of mail being adjusted, the creak of leather belts, the low murmur of prayers invoking Allah and Haji Bektashveli, the patron saint of the Janissaries. One man near the back adjusted the spoon in his hat with practiced fingers, a small ritual before battle. I keyed my radio with shaking hands. "B block security to command. Unauthorized personnel in the day room. Multiple hostiles. Request immediate reaction team." Static answered first. Then the duty officer. "Kaya, repeat. Sensors show clear." "You been hitting the energy drinks again?" Before I could respond, the formation began to move again. They executed a precise about-face and marched toward the far wall, the one abutting the ancient inner fortifications of Yedikule. As they approached, the stone rippled. For a few heartbeats, I saw the Theodosian walls materialize, towering, battle-scarred, with defenders in lamella armor desperately holding the line. Ladders slammed against phantom stone. The Janissaries surged forward, some climbing, others firing arquebuses with puffs of smoke. Shouts of "Allah! Allah!" mixed with the clash of steel. Then everything snapped back. The day room was empty once more. but every bunk in B block had been stripped and perfectly remade, not with our thin modern blankets, but with heavy wool covers that smelled strongly of wood smoke and lanolin. Small brass spoons lay neatly on several pillows, as if left by soldiers preparing for dawn prayer and battle. When the reaction team finally arrived, they found me standing in the centre of the day room, flashlights still on, staring at the wall. My body cam footage later showed only rolling static, with one single clear frame capturing the tail of a green caftan disappearing around a corner that didn't exist in the modern layout. That night, the entire platoon compared notes in hushed tones after lights out. Several others had heard the marching or caught glimpses of white hats in peripheral vision. No one slept well. We stopped calling them ghosts after that. They were elite infantry, just like us, devoted, disciplined, fearless. And in the barracks of Yedikul, they were still marching to the final assault on Constantinople. 571 years later, searching for comrades to stand the line with them. I rotated off interior security the next day, but the marching never left my ears. Every quiet corridor now carried the echo of their steps. The forgotten siege had found its way inside the wire, and the Janissaries were making sure no defender, living or dead, would stand alone. Chapter 3. Constantine's Last Stand. I'm Private First Class Tolga Demir, 4th Infantry Training Battalion. I was just a fresh transfer to Yedikule when the real weight of the place hit me. By mid-March 2024, the stories from Sergeant Aksoy and Corporal Kaya had spread through the platoon like wildfire. We tried to shrug it off during daytime drills, extra PT, weapons maintenance, classroom sessions on urban warfare. But after dark, the barracks felt alive, in a way no training manual prepares you for. It started with the sleepwalking. Every night at exactly 02:53 hours, the traditional time the final Ottoman assault began on May 29, 1453, I would find myself out of my bunk, fully dressed in combat uniform, standing on the old parade ground, facing the direction of the ancient Golden Gate. The first time it happened, I woke up with gravel under my boots and the platoon sergeant shaking me. "Demir, what the hell are you doing?" I had no memory of leaving the barracks. The second night was worse. I came to standing in the exact centre of the parade ground, staring at the massive stone arch of the old gate. My mouth moved on its own, speaking words in a language I had never studied. Medieval Greek, clear and desperate. "The Emperor is with you. Fight to the last man. The walls must hold for the sake of Christendom and Rome." Sergeant Aksoy pulled me back inside that night. I was crying without realizing it, tears cutting tracks through the dust on my face. When I could speak again, I told him what I had seen in the dream state. "I saw him, Sergeant. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos. He wasn't riding a grand horse with banners flying. He was on foot, armour-dented and bloody, his purple cloak torn and stained. His sword was broken halfway down the blade. He looked straight at me, right through 5 centuries, and said, 'The city must not fall again, not while any man still stands to defend it.' The platoon started watching me after that. They put a buddy on me at night, but it didn't stop the visions. On the night of March 20th, I was assigned to Armoury Inventory with Sergeant Aksoy. We were counting rifles and ammunition in the secure vault when the lights died without warning. The emergency red strips flickered on, casting long shadows across the racks of modern G3 rifles and tactical vests. Then the room changed. The concrete floor became rough-hewn stone strewn with rubble and broken masonry. The air filled with the stench of smoke, blood, and human waste. Shouts and screams echoed from all directions. I was no longer in the armory. I stood on a section of the Theodosian walls near the gate of St. Romanus, the critical breach point where the final assault succeeded. Around me, Byzantine defenders in lamella armour and red surcoats fought shoulder to shoulder with a handful of Genoese crossbowmen under Giovanni Giustiniani. Men swung swords, thrust spears, and loosed bolts into waves of Ottoman attackers. Our bodies piled up on the battlements. The sound was deafening. Steel on steel, cries to God and Allah. The thud of ladders against stone, the roar of men who knew they were making their last stand. At the centre of the desperate defence stood Emperor Constantine XI. He was shorter than I expected, but his presence filled the space. His armour was magnificent, yet ruined. Gilded plates dented, the double-headed eagle emblem on his chest smeared with blood. A purple cloak, now ragged, fluttered behind him as he fought like a common soldier. He parried a spear thrust from an Ottoman warrior, countered with a precise cut that dropped the man, then spun to face another attacker. For one frozen moment, the chaos around us seemed to slow. Constantine turned his head and looked directly at me across the centuries. His eyes were dark, exhausted, but burning with unyielding resolve. In perfect modern Turkish that somehow carried the weight of ancient Greek, he spoke to me. "Hold the line, son of the new Rome. They have not forgotten us. The walls may fall, but the spirit of the defenders never does." An Ottoman soldier lunged at him with a heavy axe. Constantine blocked it, his broken sword snapping completely on impact, then drove the jagged remnant into the attacker's throat. Blood sprayed. He staggered, but stayed on his feet, rallying the few remaining men with a hoarse shout. "For God and the city!" The vision collapsed as suddenly as it had come. I was back in the armory on my knees, my M4 clutched to my chest like a talisman. My hands were covered in warm, sticky blood that was not my own. It glistened in the red emergency light. Sergeant Aksoy was shouting my name and shaking my shoulders. When the main lights snapped back on, the blood vanished, as if it had never been there. I sat there for a long time, breathing hard, the taste of iron and incense still on my tongue. Sergeant Aksoy didn't push for details immediately. He just handed me a canteen and said quietly, "You saw him too, didn't you?" That night, the whole platoon gathered in the day room after lights out. More men were coming forward with fragments, glimpses of purple cloaks in mirrors, voices urging them to hold positions that no longer existed on any modern map. We realized then that the siege wasn't just replaying itself. The dead were reaching out, looking for reinforcements, for anyone willing to stand the final watch with Emperor Constantine on the broken walls of Constantinople. I still sleepwalk some nights. But now, when I wake up on the parade ground, I don't feel fear alone. I feel the weight of a duty that spans empires. Constantine didn't die begging for mercy. He died fighting among his men. And in the haunted barracks of Yedikule, his last stand continues. Every night at 02:53, calling new defenders to the line. Chapter 4. Mehmed's Shadow Army. I'm Lieutenant Omer Bash, platoon leader, 4th Infantry Training Battalion. By the first week of April 2024, the incidents at Yedikule Barracks had escalated beyond isolated sightings. What began as individual encounters with cannon fire and marching janissaries had become a collective experience that affected the entire unit. Command was growing concerned. Sleep deprivation, unexplained injuries, and a noticeable drop in training performance. Yet no official investigation could explain phenomena that left no physical trace on cameras or sensors. We were ordered to maintain operational security while continuing normal duties. That only made the nights heavier. On the evening of April 4th, I was conducting a rooftop drone calibration on the command building. The vantage point offered a clear view over the entire fortress complex and the surrounding historic grounds. The sun had set, and the first stars appeared above the minarets of modern Istanbul. I had just launched a small reconnaissance UAV when the horizon shifted. It wasn't gradual. One moment, the ridgeline was empty scrubland and chain-link fencing. The next, it filled with the vast encampment of a medieval Ottoman army. Tens of thousands of tents stretched as far as the eye could see. White and green canvas, cook-fires glowing, horses tethered in long lines, green banners bearing the white crescent, and star fluttered in a wind I couldn't feel. The air carried the scent of wood smoke, roasted meat, horse sweat, and gunpowder. At the head of this phantom host rode a young man on a magnificent white stallion. He was only 21, with a short, neatly trimmed beard just beginning to fill in. His simple kaftan and white turban contrasted with the ornate armour of his household guards. Yet an unmistakable aura of command radiated from him. Sultan Mehmed II, Fatih the Conqueror, surveyed his army with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to pierce the veil of time. I dropped the drone controller. It clattered on the roof as the UAV spiraled down and crashed somewhere in the courtyard below. I didn't care. My attention was locked on the Sultan. He raised his hand, and the entire host roared in unison, a deep, thunderous cheer that vibrated through the stone beneath my boots. Allahu Ekber echoed across the phantom camp. Then, impossibly, Mehmed detached from his army. His stallion carried him up the invisible slope until he stood on the parapet only 10 meters from my position. The horse's hooves made no sound on the modern concrete. Mehmed dismounted with fluid grace and regarded me calmly. He wore no heavy armour, just a practical green kaftan embroidered with gold thread and a simple turban. Yet the air around him crackled with authority and destiny. He spoke in measured Ottoman Turkish that translated itself in my mind. I offered them terms, soldier. Safe passage, protection for their families and churches. They refused. Now the city is mine by right of conquest. Why do your men still guard walls that have already fallen? Why do you stand where the Byzantines stood and fell? My mouth went dry, but military discipline held. I straightened to attention and answered without thinking, my voice surprisingly steady. Because some walls are never finished being defended, Sultan. We took an oath, just as your janissaries took theirs. Mehmed studied me for a long moment. A faint smile touched his lips, the same smile historians describe as both charming and terrifying, the smile of a ruler who had already rewritten the map of the world at 21. You speak with the courage of a defender, yet you wear the uniform of the children of my city. Interesting. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the fine details of his face and the intelligence burning in his dark eyes. Tell your men this. The siege ends when the last defender accepts that the city has a new master. Until then, we will keep coming. He turned, remounted his stallion in one smooth motion and stepped backward off the parapet. Horse and rider vanished mid-air, dissolving into the night as if they had never been there. The vast Ottoman camp on the horizon faded with him, leaving only the quiet lights of 21st century Istanbul. I stood alone on the roof for several minutes, heart racing, trying to process what I had just witnessed. When I finally descended, the crashed drone was undamaged on the grass. Impossible, given the height. Later that night, the entire platoon reported the same dream. Mehmed II offering surrender terms to Constantine, the emperor's refusal, and the beginning of the final decisive assault. Details matched perfectly across every man, down to the smell of the Sultan's horse and the exact wording of the offers. From that night forward, the activity intensified, but also changed tone. We no longer felt like intruders in someone else's war. We felt like witnesses, and perhaps reluctant participants, in a conflict that refused to conclude. Mehmed's shadow army had made its presence known, and the young sultan seemed almost respectful of the modern soldiers who had inherited the ground he once claimed by force. The forgotten siege was no longer only about ghosts reliving old battles. It had become a dialogue across time between conqueror and conquered, between the living guardians and the eternal ones who still marched under crescent and cross. Chapter 5. Ships Overland. I'm Specialist Ahmet Yilmaz. I'm assigned to the logistics section of the 4th Infantry Training Battalion at Yedikule Barracks. Most of my nights were quiet. Inventory checks, vehicle maintenance, and supply runs. After the stories from Sergeant Aksoy, Corporal Kaya, Private Demir, and Lieutenant Bash began circulating, I stayed skeptical. I told myself it was mass hysteria, stress from the intense training schedule, or perhaps carbon monoxide from old heating systems in the ancient stone buildings. That changed on the night of April 18th, 2024. I was running a night physical training session with a mixed group from the platoon along the old moat area that borders the southern fortifications. It was a standard 4-kilometre route, light packs, rifles, and full combat gear to build endurance. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the historic grounds. We moved in a loose formation, boots crunching on gravel, breath visible in the cool spring air. The city lights of Istanbul hummed in the distance, a constant reminder that we were in the 21st century. At approximately 22:15 hours, the air changed. A sudden, unnatural humidity rolled in, carrying the unmistakable smell of seawater, tar, wet timber, and human sweat. Then we heard it, the creaking of wooden hulls, the splash of oars in water that wasn't there, the rhythmic chanting of sailors in coordinated effort. The sound grew louder, coming from the direction of the old Galata Hills, 2 kilometers away from the actual Golden Horn. We all stopped running at the same moment. No one gave the order. We simply froze as the horizon transformed. 70 Ottoman galleys were being dragged overland, massive warships, some biremes, some larger vessels with lateen sails furled, moved slowly across the hills on greased logs. Teams of oxen and hundreds of sailors strained against thick ropes, pulling the ships inch by inch toward the Golden Horn to bypass the massive defensive chain the Byzantines had stretched across the harbour entrance. Whips cracked in the night. Officers shouted encouragement. The ground vibrated with the combined weight and effort of this impossible engineering feat. One galley passed so close that I could have reached out and touched its barnacle-encrusted hull. The wood was dark and weathered, smelling strongly of pitch and salt. Rowers bent over their oars, even though there was no water, their backs glistening with sweat under torchlight that flickered with an otherworldly glow. At the stern, the captain, a bearded man in a red caftan and turban, looked down directly at our group. He laughed, a deep, booming sound that carried over the chanting. "The chain cannot stop what Allah wills. The Sultan's will moves mountains and ships alike." I felt the cold spray of phantom sea-water on my face. My uniform grew damp. The men around me stood transfixed, some whispering prayers, others gripping their rifles on instinct. Lieutenant Bash, who had joined the PT run, raised his hand slowly as if to salute the spectral captain. The captain returned the gesture with a nod of respect before turning back to urge his crew onward. We forced ourselves to keep moving because stopping felt like surrender. We continued the route in silence, the sounds of dragging ships and chanting sailors following us the entire way. When we finally reached the barracks entrance, the entire building reeked of seawater and tar. Every toilet, sink, and even the showers ran with brackish salt water instead of fresh. Maintenance logs the next morning recorded 0 plumbing anomalies, no leaks, no contamination, no explanation for the sudden salinity. That night, several of us experienced the same vivid dream, standing on the shores of the Golden Horn as the Ottoman fleet suddenly appeared inside the harbour, catching the Byzantine defenders completely by surprise. We heard the panic in the city, the ringing of church bells, the desperate orders from Constantine's commanders. Mehmed's bold strategy had worked, and the noose around Constantinople tightened further. After the ship's overland event, the atmosphere in the barracks shifted again. The ghosts were no longer just fighting on the walls or marching in corridors. They were demonstrating the full scope of the siege, every ingenious tactic, every act of determination from both sides. We began to understand that Yedikule wasn't haunted by random spirits. It was a living classroom of military history where the participants refused to let their lessons fade. I still run that same PT route some nights when I can't sleep. Sometimes I catch the faint creak of timber or the distant crack of a whip. And when I do, I remember the captain's laugh and his words. The chain cannot stop what Allah wills. In the haunted barracks of Yedikule, neither time nor distance seemed able to stop the memory of 1453. Chapter 6. The Final Breach. I'm Staff Sergeant Burak Shahin, Senior NCO with the 4th Infantry Training Battalion at Yedikule Barracks. By late May 2024, the entire unit was operating under a quiet, unspoken protocol. We no longer questioned the sounds, the visions, or the sudden drops in temperature. We simply adapted. Extra watches were set, buddy systems enforced after dark, and every man kept a small notebook to record incidents. Command had quietly classified the situation as environmental stress for official records, but among ourselves we called it what it was. The siege had reached its climax, and we were trapped inside it. The night of 28th May into 29th May marked the 571st anniversary. The battalion was placed on lockdown. All non-essential movement restricted, extra guards on the old walls, and psychological support teams on standby, though no one dared call them that openly. Tension hung thick in the corridors. Men cleaned weapons that didn't need cleaning and checked magazines that were already full. At 0150 hours, the power failed across the entire fortress. Not a flicker or a surge, just complete, absolute darkness. Emergency generators should have kicked in within seconds. They didn't. The only light came from the faint red glow of chemical emergency sticks we cracked open. Then the walls themselves came alive. I was positioned with my squad in the central courtyard, the old parade ground surrounded by the original Ottoman-era stone structures. One moment we stood on familiar concrete and gravel. The next, the Theodosian walls materialized around us in full terrifying glory. 14 meters of triple-layered stone, towers bristling with desperate defenders. The air filled with the chaos of battle, the clash of steel, the screams of wounded men, the thunder of hooves and the relentless roar of Allah, Allah from thousands of Ottoman throats. We were no longer observers. We stood inside the final breach near the gate of St. Romanus. Byzantine soldiers in battered lamella armour and torn red surcoats fought shoulder to shoulder with the last Genoese mercenaries. Bodies lay piled 3 deep on the battlements. Ladders slammed against the walls in waves. Janissaries in white hats and green kaftans poured over the parapets, yataghans flashing in torchlight. Crossbow bolts whistled past our heads. Arrows thudded into shields that weren't there for us. At the heart of the defence stood Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos. His gilded armour was hacked and dented, the purple cloak reduced to bloody rags. His helmet was gone, revealing sweat-soaked dark hair and a face etched with exhaustion and unbreakable resolve. He fought like any common soldier, sword swinging in wide, desperate arcs. "For God and the city," he shouted, his voice hoarse but carrying over the din. "Hold the line. Rome will not fall while we still breathe." A massive Ottoman assault wave hit. Janissaries surged forward in disciplined ranks, supported by Azab irregulars and Sipahi cavalry pressing from behind. The breach widened with every minute. Stone crumbled under the weight of sheer numbers and relentless pressure. I watched, helpless yet unable to look away, as a janissary drove a spear toward the emperor. Constantine parried it with his shield, countered with a savage cut that felled the man, then spun to face 2 more attackers. For one eternal moment the entire scene seemed to slow, and every ghost, Ottoman and Byzantine alike, turned their heads toward us, the living soldiers of the 4th Battalion standing in perfect formation in the middle of their ancient battlefield. Their eyes met ours across 5.5 centuries. There was no hatred in those gazes, only recognition, soldier to soldier. Then Mehmed II's voice rolled across the courtyard like thunder, young yet carrying the weight of destiny. "You have guarded well, sons of the New Age. The city is taken, but your watch does honour to both sides. Now rest." The final moments unfolded in horrifying clarity. Constantine, realizing the end had come, removed his purple cloak and plunged into the thickest fighting, determined to die as an ordinary soldier rather than be captured. "The city is yours," he cried as he cut down another attacker. An Ottoman axe struck him down in the press of bodies. He fell fighting, sword still in hand, among his men. The double-headed eagle emblem on his chest disappeared beneath the tide of green and white. The vision held for several heartbeats longer. We felt the heat of the fires, smelled the blood and smoke, heard the final church bells ringing in panic across phantom Constantinople. Then, as suddenly as it began, the walls dissolved. The courtyard returned to its modern form, silent cold, lit only by our chemical sticks. We found ourselves standing in perfect military formation, rifles at port arms, every man present and accounted for. Tears streamed down faces that had seen combat tours in Syria and beyond. No one spoke. No one broke ranks. We simply stood there, honouring the dead on both sides who had just shown us their final moments. When power finally restored itself at 300, we discovered small anomalies throughout the barracks. Swords cuts appeared on several men's arms and torsos. Shallow, clean wounds that looked days old, but had not been there at dusk. They healed completely by morning, with no scarring. Every bunk in the affected blocks had been neatly arranged with phantom wool blankets that vanished by sunrise. That anniversary night changed something fundamental in all of us. The siege of 1453 was no longer ancient history replaying on loop. It had reached its brutal conclusion right in front of us, and both the conquerors and the conquered had acknowledged our presence as fellow guardians of the same ground. We buried no bodies that night, but we carried the weight of what we witnessed. The final breach at Constantinople had opened once more inside Yedikule barracks, and for a few terrible, magnificent hours we stood the line with Emperor Constantine and faced the army of Sultan Mehmed II. Some walls fall, some duties never end. Chapter 7. Eternal Guardians of the Walls. I'm Sergeant Mehmet Aksoy again. After the night of the final breach on 29th May 2024, everything at Yedikule barracks changed. The intense, violent visions that had built over weeks suddenly softened. The cannon fire grew distant, the marching feet quieter. What replaced the chaos was something far more unsettling, a quiet, enduring presence that walked the walls with us. The siege hadn't ended. It had simply settled into a permanent watch. In the weeks and months that followed, the ghosts no longer appeared as desperate attackers or doomed defenders in the heat of battle. They became sentries, silent partners on the line. I returned to perimeter duty on the old southern wall overlooking the Golden Gate area in early June. It was 0300 hours, the same witching time when the bombard had first spoken. The night was still, the lights of modern Istanbul twinkling peacefully in the distance. I had my G3 slung, night vision down, thermos of tea at my side. I expected another bombardment or a sudden rush of Janissaries. Instead, I felt a presence to my left. A single Janissary stood on the parapet beside me. He wore the familiar white felt Burke hat with the small brass spoon, a green kaftan over mail, and a yataghan at his hip. His face was young, the same soldier who had spoken to Corporal Kaya weeks earlier. He didn't look at me directly at first. His eyes scanned the darkened grounds below with the calm, professional vigilance of an experienced sentry. The temperature around him dropped noticeably, but it was no longer the bone-chilling cold of terror. It felt almost companionable. I stood very still, heart rate elevated but controlled. After everything we had witnessed, panic no longer came easily. I slowly turned my head and spoke in a low, respectful voice. "Evening, brother. Quiet night?" The Janissary turned. His dark eyes met mine. For the first time, there was no urgency, no call to arms. He studied me for a long moment, then gave a single, slow nod. He reached out with one gloved hand toward the parapet as if testing the stone, then looked back out over the city. In that archaic Ottoman Turkish I now understood without effort. He said softly, "The walls stand. The watch continues." I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. I unclipped my pack of cigarettes shook one out, and offered it to him on my open palm. He looked at it curiously, then took it between his fingers. I lit my own and held the lighter out. The flame passed through his hand, but he brought the cigarette to his lips anyway. He inhaled deeply, held it, and exhaled a plume of smoke that mingled with the night air before fading. A small, tired smile touched his lips. He nodded once more in thanks, then turned his gaze back to the horizon. We stood that watch together in silence for the next 50 minutes. 2 soldiers, 571 years apart, guarding the same stretch of wall. When Corporal Kaya arrived for relief, the janissary simply faded away, leaving only the faint scent of tobacco and wood smoke. That became the new pattern. Over the following months, different men reported similar encounters. Private Demir would wake from sleepwalking to find a Byzantine guardsman in lamella armor standing at the foot of his bunk, quietly watching over him until he fell back asleep. Lieutenant Bash found Mehmed II himself standing on the command building roof one night, not as a conqueror this time, but as a young commander inspecting his fortifications. The Sultan gave him a respectful nod before vanishing. The activity never stopped completely. Sometimes we still heard the distant boom of Urban's bombard or the creak of phantom galleys being dragged overland. But these were echoes now, not assaults. The soldiers of 1453 had accepted us as the new garrison. In return, we began leaving small offerings in the old corridors: a piece of fresh bread, a cup of clean water, a Turkish flag patch, or a single cigarette. Every morning the offerings were gone, never stolen, simply taken by those who still stood the eternal watch. New recruits arriving at Yedikule now receive a quiet, unofficial briefing from the veterans. If you hear marching after lights out, do not raise the alarm. If you smell black powder on the night wind, do not run. Stand your post. They are only finishing what they started, and they will stand it with you. I rotated out of Yedikule 6 months after the anniversary night. The nightmares have mostly faded, but on certain quiet nights, especially when the call to prayer drifts across the Bosphorus at dawn, I still catch the faint scent of gunpowder and wood smoke. Sometimes I wake, reaching for a rifle that isn't there, only to realize I was standing watch with a janissary or a Byzantine spearman who simply wanted company on the long night. The Siege of Constantinople ended on May 29, 1453. The city fell. The empire changed hands. But the walls themselves never forgot, and neither did the men who defended them or conquered them. In the haunted barracks of Yedikule, both sides continue their vigil. Ottoman and Byzantine, conqueror and conquered, now stand shoulder to shoulder with the living soldiers of the Turkish land forces. They no longer fight each other. They guard the same ground together. Some duties transcend time, empire, and death itself. We are all eternal guardians of the walls now.